Welcome to an extended episode of the Coach Up podcast. I am super excited to have Alec Spradling with me. Alec, I hope I said that correctly. You're going to correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct. Yes, for
But
sure.
I'm very excited to have you here today. And I'm excited for you all to hear from Alec because we are going to, in addition to what he does, we're going to talk about a very interesting topic that I know corporate leaders as well as professional coaches will be very interested in hearing about. And so, Alec, will you? Oh, I don't know if I said this. I'm Kanisha Hart. I am the host of the Coach Up podcast, and this is an extension of that podcast. So, welcome to everybody here. Alec, will you explain and introduce yourself and tell people who you are and what you do?
Of course, and thank you, Kaneshi, for that nice introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Alexander Spradling. I go by Alec, mostly so I don't have to translate it. And I currently live in Austin, Texas. I've lived in different parts of the United States and abroad, speak several languages. Mostly I've been a coach most of my professional life. I was also a consultant for a number of years, dealing with organizational development issues. And these days I coach online and I focus on specialties like leadership, organizational behavior, communication, mindfulness, and self-regulation. So those are sort of the areas that I'm most familiar with. That was about 30 seconds, I think. Anything else you want me to add?
Then I will dive a little deeper.
Okay.
Well, I'll ask a couple of questions. So, when you say you've been a coach most of your life, when we talked, you mentioned that you were a coach before anybody actually really knew what coaching was.
Mm,
And you also mentioned self regulation. So, I want to dive into
mm.
that really quickly because I think that's a term that we hear, but how are you
Well,
applying that when you talk about self regulation and helping people with it?
absolutely. So what I mean by that is I started coaching. Actually, I was looking at the actual date because I've forgotten. 1980. So basically, I was looking for a job. I was in San Francisco. I was looking for a job. I had never heard of coaching before, except in sports. And I found a job in the newspaper in those days. And so I happened to be a small HR company, sort of a, what we call boutique kind of company these days. And these people were doing sort of consulting and coaching with companies, mostly from an HR perspective. And so basically, I learned through mentoring, looking at people who were doing the work. And I immediately decided, this is something I really enjoy doing, and I think I can be really good at it. So eventually, moving fast forward in time, eventually coaching started to become much more known, and people started using coaching for lots of things. And eventually, organizations like the ICF came into being, and eventually, coaching started to become more formalized and structured, and so forth. But overall, this time, I've pretty much sort of developed my own approach, and that's obviously founded on a strong background that I have in the human sciences, psychology, philosophy, organizational behavior. I have a master's and a PhD. My master's was mostly in psychology, mostly from a what we call today health psychology perspective. And my PhD was in human science, which was basically I wanted to be a teacher, a professor at university. I decided, no, that's not for me eventually. But so I have a very strong background in terms of doing research and being very rigorous in the way of approach different subjects. And I also have a very strong background in mindfulness and meditation, if you will. I started, with Hinduism, then I moved into Buddhism, and I've been doing that since I'm 19 years old. And at one point, I even thought about becoming a monk, but I decided not to do it, which I don't regret actually. And so that's basically, I'm also multicultural. I speak several languages and I coach in several languages. And so basically, that's in a nutshell my story. Regarding self regulation, do you want me to continue or? make a pause or
Yes,
yeah?
please.
Okay. Okay. So, okay, self-regulation. So what I
Continue.
mean by, yeah, thank you. So what I mean by that is that I'm a strong believer that the way we experience life, reality, if you will, the way we experience the world or the way we experience ourselves, it's shaped and conditioned really by our mind. In other words, it's uh, our ability to understand how our mind, by mind I mean our thoughts, our emotions, our impulses, even our sensations, the ones that come through the senses, the way we internalize and interpret those sensations, thoughts, emotions, etc., shape how we conceive our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with the world. So our ability to self-regulate simply means our ability to be aware of what's going on internally from the point of view of what is it that we're thinking, what is it that we're feeling, what is it that we're sensing, what impulses do we have, and so forth. And to the extent that we are able to understand, not understand intellectually, but just be aware of these things in real time, that empowers us to be able to, I don't know the word control, but at least to regulate how we respond to, thousands of triggers, right? In a single day, we have thousands of triggers. That this is not neither good nor bad, right? But we're always responding in one way or another. And if those responses are unconscious or we're not aware of how we're responding, then we get easily stuck, in patterns, and we can't outgrow them because we don't understand what's going on. So our ability to self-regulate simply means that, and if we can do that, that gives us a huge amount of agency, if you will, and power to really shape how we experience our life, essentially, right? And so, to me, that's really the foundation of any type of personal change and personal transformation. I'm going to stop there.
So we hear that, but we think about how to practically apply that. This is work that you've been doing for years.
Mm,
Where are the places where we as humans fail to do that? What are the habits that you find a lot of us have where we
yeah,
miss the opportunity to self-regulate?
sure. So I suppose the easiest thing to do would be to recognize that it's not easy to be aware of what we're experiencing in a given moment because we're not really wired, from evolution, from the point of view of evolution. Evolution really prepared us to deal with the outside world. We're always looking at what's going on around us to detect any threats or any opportunities that can either enhance or hurt our ability to survive, essentially. So paying attention to what's going on internally, if you will, or how we're relating to whatever is going on at a given moment in time, it's not something that we can do naturally without some discipline or effort or some deliberate intention to do it. So it does require some discipline. So that's the first thing. So in other words, if we don't practice, then we're not going to develop that skill. It's actually more than a skill. It's like a universal capacity. That mindfulness is a universal capacity that we all have, but we just don't use it to its full potential, basically, right? So that's one thing. And the other one is that there's a huge amount of inertia that, in terms of patterns and habits that we develop throughout our lifetime, and those patterns and those habits have a huge amount of inertia. So it's almost like trying to swim upstream against the current sometimes, and that also requires a certain amount of effort, right? And so the only way to sort of decide for yourself like the effort and the discipline, if you will, is worth it, is to understand, number one, what is why you're doing it, essentially, right? And usually you're doing it for two reasons. One is because you're suffering in some form, right? Suffering can take many forms, and you decided maybe this is one way to try to mitigate that, and so doing this kind of work is going to help. Or the other one is simply because you simply understand or believe that this can help you with your own personal growth or transformation. So this is why we get stuck, essentially. So forgetfulness, or an inertia, essentially, right? Or third one,
I would
the
ask the
third one.
question, how do we get,
Mhm. Go ahead, go ahead.
what's the third one?
No, the third one would be someone might also
Well,
simply find that not interesting, not they don't see the point, right? So that could also be.
I would ask about the inertia, but I think we probably can all assume that, when I think about inertia, I think about all of the information that's coming at us, automatically think about what's online and what we're plugged
Mm,
into. But additionally, the people around us, the people that we're talking to, the environment that we're in, the people who are in that environment, the situations that are happening. So we're just immersed in a lot of information, a lot of
yeah,
activity in our lives. And we invite some of that in, right? Because we
sure.
connect online, we connect to our phones, we connect to
Mm,
social media. And so we intentionally, often out of habit, pull that
yeah.
inertia in that is not allowing that free way for us to make room and to move forward. I guess I'm curious about the discipline aspect. And so when we talk about self regulation and you have to practice
Mm,
it, and there's a discipline aspect that goes with that, Alec, are
sure.
there things that you teach, or are there systems or methods that you have worked with your clients over the years to help them
Mm-hmm.
be disciplined? Because I find
Right. Yeah.
one thing I pray about to Jesus on a regular basis is,
Mm-hmm.
Lord, give me the spirit of self control or sound mind, as
Right.
it's called in the Bible, but discipline, because I, on my own will, struggle with discipline, but I know the Lord can help
Right.
me. But we also have to put in place practical things. So, are there some things that
Sure.
you teach that
Right.
help with the discipline aspect to
Yeah.
practice this self regulation?
Great question, Kanishi. So basically, what I do is first, from a point of view of a coach, right? So I try to understand what's the experience for that individual that I'm coaching. What's it like for them to live their life, right?
Mm.
So because if I don't understand what things look like from their perspective, it's kind of difficult to tailor techniques or methodologies to a particular person because this person is unique and what works for one person may not work for someone else. So, but generally speaking, you can work on different levels and they're all complementary. Yeah, complementary. So, one level is a level of values, right? So, meaning being clear on what your values are, right? So, for example, if you say, I want to practice, kindness, for example, because I believe that kindness is important. So, okay, then you have to figure out, okay, what does that look like in the real world? What is it that I would need to do to demonstrate to myself and possibly to others that I am kind or that my behavior is kind? So once you have identified those things, then you start looking for opportunities to do it. And if you're in a situation where you notice you're getting triggered and you're starting to feel really unkind, right, whatever the opposite of that is, then you remind yourself of your value. And so that's the main function of values. If you don't want them to remain sort of abstract concepts, the reason when they're important is when you're having doubts, right? Or when you're saying, well, I don't really want to do this, right? But then you remember your values and you say, yes, I need to do this because I actually believe in this. So sometimes, even if it's against my best interest, right? And so that the values fulfill a very important function. The values, it can be many times. I mean, for some people, they're tied into a religion. For some people, they're tied into some kind of spiritual path. For some people, it's more a philosophical kind of situation. You know, it's about ethics and morality. The important thing is that you have these set of values that come to the rescue. You know, when you're undecided, when you think you may be taking the wrong path or something like that. So that's one. The other one is to so understand why is it that you want to do whatever you say you want to do. So, for example, if you say, I want to be more disciplined about the way I attend to my life, the way about in which I show up in a relationship, for example, or the way I manage my time, you know, so that I'm not always, you know, busy and distracted and taking in information. I have time to sort of chill out, enjoy a nice meal, enjoy a nice walk, enjoy a nice conversation. So you have to know why you're doing this. And that is also very important because that's what's going to drive your behavior. The other thing is to say, um, so that then it gets more concrete. So, for example, if you say, well, let's pick an example. Maybe someone can have an example of something because then it gets really concrete. Might be something you want to do related to discipline, for example.
Mm, okay. I want to consistently do a video a day
Okay.
um, on either YouTube or one of the social media platforms talking about either someone on my podcast or something I speak about, but
Mm.
one every single day.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a very good example because it's very concrete, right? It's something you can measure. And so now we're
Mm,
getting really concrete. Now, so you can do a bunch of things. For example, first make sure it's a sort of a smart goal. Let's put it that way, right? That is doable, right? That has a timeline, that it has something that you can measure, and that is achievable. So once you decided, yeah, I mean, this is a realistic goal, right? Then what you do
yeah.
is you organize your time in such a way that you can actually do that, right? So all that's the easy part. The difficult part is all of a sudden time comes for you to do your video and you have like a conflict, right? Like, oh no, but I really should be doing something else, etc. Well, you have a decision to make, right? And this is when it's important to be honest with oneself. Like, okay, so if I'm conflicted about this, is it because I have a real conflict, meaning something came up that's really important that I need to deal with? Or is it just that I don't feel like doing it, right? Maybe I'm a little tired, or maybe today I'm not in the mood for that, right? So you have to be honest with yourself because just because you have a conflict, that's not necessarily a problem. Conflicts come up all the time, right? And so it doesn't mean you have to stubbornly, push through. Sometimes it's not a good idea to push through. And what matters is that you're honest with yourself, and whatever decision you make it in full awareness, without excuses, right? You fully own that decision.
Mm-hmm.
That way, you're not going to experience guilt, right? That way, you fully own it. It says, "No, I know why I made that decision. That was the best call I could make at the time. Let's move on." Right? And so it's
Mm-hmm.
when we don't do that, is later on we have regrets and we have a little guilt and we say, well, that wasn't good. I didn't live up to my commitments. That's because you or anybody, right? You didn't think this through and you didn't really own the decision fully.
Okay.
So, mm,
I like the fact that by owning it, we eliminate the guilt because you're right.
yeah,
That often
mm,
comes back very quickly, and we can even remember the last time we did the same thing and feel guilty, but we'll still
yeah,
make the decision now in the moment that we'll feel guilty about later. But if we own it, then we're accepting and saying, right now, based on the information I have,
Mm.
this is what I am choosing to do, which is really good.
Right, right.
I really I like the conflict that you brought up because some words can be so powerful in helping us to
Mm.
describe what's really going on, right? In order to address something, you have to admit it, and admit it
Right,
meaning you have to name it. And so we have that conflict that you're talking about, that tension, those back and forth thoughts, but we don't recognize them as a conflict. And but by saying it's a conflict, then I can say,
yeah,
okay, what am I going to choose as the resolution? That puts me
right,
back in control instead of being at the whim of my emotions or my
right.
double-minded thought process. And so I want to move into a segue where we talked about, just because I know our time and I'm sure I'll have some questions, but we talked about conflict of a different nature when it comes to
Mm.
coaching in the professional versus the corporate world.
Oh yeah,
And so, can you take us in that direction about
sure.
this was the thing that caused me to even reach out to you on LinkedIn
Right,
because
right.
you made a
Yeah.
statement about the difference between the two.
Mm.
And so, can you share what your thoughts are around that
Yep.
really struck me
Sure.
as interesting, and which is why I thought, oh my goodness, I definitely have a conversation with Alec.
Mm. Okay, sure. So what I'm going to describe now is basically a way of thinking about coaching in the workplace that comes out of my experiences coaching individuals, but also my experience studying or what I call organizational behavior, right? Because the thing about the workplace is really a social system. It's a social system or a human activity system. It has its own basically rules, right? And dynamics and so forth. And if you don't understand how that system operates, whether you like it or you don't like it, it's a different issue, but it operates in a particular way, broadly speaking. Then, and if you're trying to introduce something into that system without understanding how the system works, the system is either going to reject it or it's going to work around it either to make it fit, right? Or it's going to pretend it's working. I mean, it's going to become a little dysfunctional. So let me turn this up here just a second. So the main difference that sometimes coaches don't make or managers fail to make is the fact that when a manager, let's talk again, put it this way. First of all, when I talk about coaching in the workplace, I'm referring to a manager who has direct reports, and one of the responsibilities or accountabilities, as I call it, of a manager is leadership. And leadership involves doing a certain amount of things. One of those things is coaching, right? And coaching takes place, is part of a process. It's not a standalone activity. So coaching is part of a process that I call that starts with setting expectations, that starts with delegation, continues with delegation, that starts with evaluating results of performance, giving feedback about the results of performance, and then coaching the individual if the individual needs coaching, usually to help them improve their performance or develop, in their career and so forth. And then that continues, then you measure the results of the coaching and so forth. So it's not a standalone activity like it happens in professional coaching, where the professional coach is not really accountable for the results of their client in the workplace, for example. The manager is. That's another difference. In other words, the manager cannot be neutral about what the coachee, in this case is one of his or her direct reports, does as a result of the coaching, because what the coachee does has consequences for the team and also obviously for the coachee also, but for the team and for the organization. So that means a manager needs to be a lot more explicit than a coach. A manager needs to be more clear about what are the expectations of the coaching process. What is it that we're going to be measuring in terms of whether there's been a change, a progress of some kind, and what are the consequences if the expectations are not met, right? Both positive and sometimes negative. A coach doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have to do all that. That's it's a lot easier in many ways, right? And so when a manager doesn't understand that that's natural for them to have to do that, and they have an idea of coaching that's sort of, let's say, purist, it's kind of like the way a professional coach, it makes them very conflicted because it says, how can I be a leader and a coach at the same time? I mean, it's almost like you have to
Mm-hmm.
choose, right? But you don't have to choose. And so the manager, therefore, that's one area that's probably the most important one, where being a manager coach is different, it's substantially in some ways, from a professional coach. Some things don't change, obviously, in terms of being open to asking a lot of questions, trying to help the person reflect and reason about their issues so they can come up with the answers and the solutions, right? So that doesn't change. But some things do change, and those things are really important because otherwise it's just it's just not going to work. It's going to make the manager feel uncomfortable. The coachees also are going to be confused, right? Because, oops, I think Ganesh, you're still there.
I
You're back,
am
right?
back. You're
You're
good.
back.
You're good.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, because imagine the coachee who also has a purist kind of view of coaching and says to the manager, "Who are you to coach me? Like, why are you coaching me?" Well, if you say that to a coach, it says, "Well, because you selected me. If you don't want to work with me anymore, it's totally fine, right?"
Right.
Managers say, "Well, because I'm your manager, you can't
Right.
fire me. You can't fire me as your coach. It's part of your
Right.
job, right?" And so, again, this just being realistic. That's the way that system works. Now, if you don't like the way it works, then you got to change the way organizations work. But that's a different story, right? And so those are some of the important
Yeah.
differences.
Those are so important because it's so much of a different type of pressure
Mm.
for the manager in the corporate setting, especially if they're accustomed to and they know what you call purist coaching,
Right.
because there are those expectations of goals met, objectives met, milestones met, that
Right.
not only is the employee accountable for, but the manager is accountable for.
Yeah.
Whereas that doesn't have to be the case in professional coaching. But my question is, Alec, what's your opinion about having the same type of approach in professional coaching where the goals are explicit,
Mm.
the there is pressure of some type to complete the objectives or to get the goals and the key objective KPIs, key performance
Key performance
objectives,
indicators. Yeah.
indicators, right?
Yeah.
Should there be more of that pressure in the professional coaching world?
Hmm. That's a good question. So, essentially, is think about an authority in a way, right? So, a manager has a formal authority, meaning the authority of a manager to give feedback or to set expectations, if you will, even if it's in conversation with, through a dialogue and all that, sure. To give feedback and to coach, to measure results and et cetera, and to make decisions based on those results comes from their role as a manager. It's not personal, right? A coach is different
Yeah.
because the role of the coach essentially is a much more equal. It's two people who are equals, right? The only difference is they're playing a role in addition to being person to person. It's also coach to coachee. So if you want to
Yeah.
add that layer that you just described, the only way to do it well would be for the coachee to grant the coach
Mm,
the authority to do that. In other words,
okay.
I'm granting you for the purpose of our relationship, as long as it lasts, I'm granting
Mm-hmm.
you the authority to hold me accountable for living up to my commitments, for example. right? But that authority doesn't come from the coach, right?
Huh.
It
Okay.
comes from the coachee, and the coachee can take it away anytime.
It's a big
Mm.
difference.
It's a big
That's
difference,
a
exactly.
very yeah, but that's also a great way for that to happen because I think
Mm.
about managers who or leaders in corporate America who may go into coaching and who are accustomed
Right.
to setting goals for people, being a little more assertive with
Mm-hmm.
telling clients what to do versus allowing clients to articulate and guiding them in what they want to do. Um, that I can see that being a little bit of a difficult transition. And I say that because I
Mm.
did coaching as a leader and a manager in the corporate world,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I don't coach in the professional world. And but
Yeah.
I know I understand the difference in theory,
Mm.
but I know it would be my tendency to want to set the goals for the people for the clients
Right.
versus
Yeah. Yeah.
allowing them that ability to give me the permission to do so. And so I think that's a great solution for that
Mm.
problem.
Yeah. I mean, like everything, it's very often it comes down to considering the trade-offs. So, for example, let's imagine the scenario where you have a coach who, for whatever reasons, decides to be very directive with their coachee. Well, I think you should do this, and oops, I don't know why that's happening. Um, decides to be very directive with their coachee, and I think you should do this, or that wasn't right. So technically, an organization like the ICF would say, well, that's not coaching. I'm not as stuck on those things, but the problem is that that's going to skew the relationship, right? That kind of approach and that relationship, because you could have a coachee who actually likes that. You could have a coachee who wants to be directed. I mean, it can happen, right? But the question is that in the best interest of the coachee? Is that going to help the coachee really grow and learn, right? Or is it just going to keep them in the same pattern they're used to,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
So that's the
Yeah,
fundamental question,
yeah,
right?
that's
And
good.
so everything you do has a price in a way, right? In a way, so either good or bad in the sense like if you do it that way, sure, you may get some results. Maybe it's super efficient. Maybe you get things done faster.
Hmm.
Like, but you're also paying a price, and the price is what happens to that relationship, and how is the coachee really learning from that experience. Or someone says, comes to you and says, let's say you're an expert in some subject matter, and someone says, listen, I need to make a decision about this and that, and I don't really know what to do, et cetera, et cetera. And you help them think, and in 15 minutes they come up with a solution. And maybe throughout that process you gave some personal perspective on that. Maybe that's fine. And so sometimes it's not a question of um, it's more like what's the spirit behind what you do, what's the intention, and what's the impact, right? Rather than the form itself.
Okay. So as you're talking about the relationship may change with the
Mm,
coachee from that
right.
perspective or that approach, what is the impact that you've seen and you've researched that happens with the coachee in the who's being coached in the corporate world? How is that type of coaching, what's the impact on them, where both coach and coachee have expectations that they have to meet, there's pressure, there's deadlines.
Mm.
How does that impact that coachee in how they think and how they process and how they respond?
Well, it's hard to generalize because everything is context dependent. So, in other words, what's natural in a particular context is not natural in another context. So, if you're in a workplace being under some pressure and having expectations and having to perform is part of the context, right? If you don't like that context, then you're not going to be happy working in a workplace, except maybe for some maybe. And so in that context, right, if you're being coached, sort of by your manager, and you're coaching in the way I described before, right? So in other words, where you're more explicit about what's expected, you're talking about measuring results. The manager, in fact, even sometimes may determine unilaterally, in some cases, what is the expectation, right? Uh,
Yeah.
if the coachee understand that that's natural in that context, then that's not necessarily a problem. Now, if you try to replicate that in a very different context, like a professional coaching relationship context, then that wouldn't be natural. That would somehow generate noise, in that relationship, right? So it's all very context dependent. But technically, coaching can be extremely helpful. The essence of coaching, right? The idea of coaching in the workplace, and in fact, that's why it's probably growing a lot, because in a lot of organizations, in a lot of managers, they're not used to that. It's more of a sort of command and control kind of situation, or a lot of top down sort of relationships can be a little bit also impersonal. So when you're coaching, very often as a coach, you need to make yourself a little vulnerable in basically simply saying, I don't have all the answers, I'm not perfect, I don't have all the answers, so we're trying to figure out this together, actually. So some managers are comfortable doing that. For some managers, that feels extremely vulnerable, right? So but if you can do that well, and you both respond to that, then the relationship, becomes a lot more interesting and richer.
Right.
Mm.
Let me ask you this, because you've been coaching for 44 years now, which is
Don't
amazing.
remind me. Just kidding.
That's a great thing, though. Because
Yeah.
coaching, the name of coaching has become so popular in the last decade, maybe 2 decades, that there's not a lot of tenured coaches
Mm.
around, right? It's something that people are popping into. It's very unregulated. In
Yeah.
some instances, people are calling themselves coaches just because, to your point, they may have a specialization knowledge of something in a specialty area,
Mm.
but they may not know how to coach. So really, they're like a trainer,
Right.
but they are doing it over an extended period of time, so they call themselves a coach. So you have been in the game for a while, which means you've got experience, and that's the positive. So that's what I'm
Mm.
asking about. Um, in your work as a coach and then the evolution of it, can you just talk about like you deal with change management, change organizational behavior, which all has to do with how we behave as human beings, how we respond,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
self-regulation. Can you give just maybe one or two tips to coaches to help them improve in their coaching of individuals? Just a couple of things that are foundational, that maybe you see coaches struggle with, or individuals that you interact with, that if they commit to just grasp that concept and make a tweak, that their coaching would be more
Um,
impactful and powerful for their
mm.
clients.
Okay. Okay. Well, there are a lot of things that, in fact, some of the more difficult things are actually some of the simplest things are the more difficult ones. So, for example, one thing that's very difficult sometimes to do is to go into the coaching engagement or conversation with an open mind, meaning like is sort of with a beginner's mind, to use the phrase, as opposed to feeling you have to be driving the conversation, you have to be adding value, you have to um, have an answer for things, and then you have to be ready for anything. So being able to approach it with an open mind, sort of a beginner's kind of mind, not pretending to yourself that you need to be in control or you need to be able to handle whatever the client throws at you. It's okay sometimes to say, listen, I don't know about that. Maybe, well, let's talk about it. So being kind of relaxed in a way about this, that's sometimes the most difficult thing to do, right? Because if you can do that, then it's basically two people, it's having a conversation. It's sort of the art that hides the art. Right? There's an old expression in the art. It's like it doesn't sound that there's much going on, but there's actually a lot going on. But on the surface, it looks like two people just talking.
Right.
Right. So on the surface, it looks like there's not much going on here. I mean, it's almost like when you see, people who play sports at a very high level, they make it look easy. Right? This is how do you do that? I mean, it's like I can do that. No, you can't. Right? And so,
Right.
so that's one of the hardest things to do. And so the other thing that's kind of related to that is because very often, I know this is what I'm saying is a little complex to describe, but basically it's almost like you're going on this road, right? And you have a sense of the general direction, but things happen, and so all of a sudden, a side, a road opens up here, and you have to decide, well, am I going? Shall we go this way, or shall we continue, right? And if you get too hang up on this thing, and you're too much thinking about, what shall I say next, or what shall I do next, that's going to take you out of the present moment. You're going to disconnect, actually. You're going to be in your head, right? And so if you can trust that you're going to figure out the best way to move forward, and that's not easy to do, right? You have to trust that you can do that well. Then you can sort of, engage fully with a person, and the person doesn't even notice that they're being coached, right? Maybe at the
It's
end
just
of
a
the session,
conversation.
it's just a conversation. They say, "Wow, that was wow." It was like, and so yeah, that's the most difficult thing to do. Mm, then what other
Gotcha.
things? Mm,
Well, let me
trying to
ask
think about.
this.
Sure.
As you're talking through this, I'm thinking what this sounds like to me. And this is probably because I am um, on this disc personality scale, for those that are familiar with it, I'm a D. So I'm the direct, let's cut through all the chase, let's get to the
Oh,
point, let's
yeah,
have
yeah,
smart goals. Right. That's my
yeah.
personality. So when I
Okay.
hear you talk about this, Alec, I think, okay, this could cause a conversation with the client to help them get to them setting their own goals, them coming to their own realizations. This could take 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 conversations, and that can be with
Mm,
anything that they're trying to work through and work toward.
right.
To me, as a D personality type, I at the second conversation, I'm like, why haven't we gotten there yet? But
Okay. Okay.
that's
Okay.
not always
Yeah.
helpful, right, for the
Yeah.
people.
Okay.
So my question is,
Yeah.
how do you, as a coach, how do you help
Yeah.
to move the client toward, for those that
Mm,
need it, move
yeah.
them toward something that is concrete so that action can be taken versus
Sure.
getting from going around the mountain?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, obviously, if you frame it in those two choices, they look like they're not even compatible, right? But in fact, the two things are compatible, and the way to make them compatible Because obviously I understand that the way I described the first thing, it could sound like it's very meandering and you're just having a great conversation. It may take, it's like psychoanalysis, like 20 years later, you're still saying, are we getting there? No, not
Okay.
quite like that. No, no, you have to blend that. So for example, if you do an on-demand session, which is something I do sometimes, where you're going to see a person one time, they come with a very specific problem and they only have 45 minutes, period. Okay, so obviously you have to be very efficient, right? It's about
Mhm.
efficiency, right? You have to use those 45 minutes efficiently. So one thing I do, and it's sometimes a valid technique, is to check with the client whether they're open to being a very direct kind of conversation, but really efficient, right? So in other words, you have to be very selective about which paths you take and which ones you don't, right? So in other words, let's say a client is saying something and then all of a sudden they mention something. Well, the coach say, well, let's go explore this issue. But if that takes you away from the main goal, then you can't go that
Mhm.
way, right? So you
Okay.
have to keep those two things in mind, right? So if the client and you have an understanding that efficiency is really important for the client, they want to, have results as quickly as possible. And they sometimes clients don't want to get too introspective, right? They just want to know, how to make a decision, right? Well, fine, then you adapt, right? You adapt to that. That's not your call. It's not like you have to impose your preferred way of coaching. And so you blend those two
Mhm.
things, right? And being direct, by the way, is not the same thing as being blunt. So sometimes people confuse those two things, right? So direct means,
Yeah.
I mean, if you have to go from town A to town B, and there is three different freeways you can take, and one takes an hour and a half, one takes an hour, and one takes 30 minutes, except that the one that takes 30 minutes, there's a lot of trucks. Well, you have to decide, do I want to prioritize efficiency, get there sooner, even though it's not a pretty ride? Or do I want to take more time and enjoy the ride, but take longer, right?
Right.
So you have to make those calls, right? And as long as you and the client are on the same page about this, then it shouldn't be a problem.
Gotcha.
Hmm.
That's really good advice. The part that you said about if the client is, we're talking through something and
Hmm.
then the client touches on something else,
Yeah,
and either they start to go down that route or we want to, talk about it. If it's not heading toward where we're
yeah,
trying to get,
yeah,
we
yeah.
can't do it. And I think
Right.
that's so helpful because I know I can speak for myself. I want people to feel heard and I want them to
Hmm.
feel as though when you're talking to me, you can share whatever you need to share. You can, if you need to get it off of your chest or you need to talk out loud about it and talk
Hmm.
through it, that's what I'm here for. Where that's not actually what a coach may be there for. A coach is there to help you with what you've established you want to get help with. And the coach's job is to help you stay on track to get there.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, in the best way to do it, actually, if you notice the client is going on a sort of side path, let's say they're talking about some personal issue they have with someone right in the present, and all of a sudden they start talking about their family history. And they go, oh, because when I was a kid, this and that. All that information is obviously relevant in some form, right? It's not irrelevant, but from the point of view of getting to where you want to go in the period of time you have, it may not be that useful, right? And so you can tell the client, listen, I, I'd be happy to go to explore that issue if you want to. However, I just have to let you know that, based on the agreement that we had, that we only have 45 minutes or we want to do this as fast as possible. I don't think this path would be very productive. How do you feel about that? Right? And let them decide, you know.
That's excellent. I can tell you've been coaching for a while, Alec.
Okay.
The experience comes through for
Okay.
sure. This is the thing that always happens. I always have such amazing guests, such as you, that the time runs out sooner than my questions run out. but I do want to respect your time because we were set to be on from 5 to 6. Got a little bit of a late start on my part. But I want people to know how you can help them, who you help again. So, who your client is, and people who are looking for coaching, why they would find you because they have this problem that you solve. So, can you tell
Right.
people that information of who you work with and who would be who you are able to help, and then how they can get in touch with you?
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Well, I work with people in different, say, age brackets. Because from experience, I can work with people. I like working with young people. Actually, it's very. I just get very excited about that. But I also work with people at different stages of their lives and careers. I don't specialize in a particular, population or anything like that. I do work on certain subjects. Some of them are more life related, some are more professional related. But my specialties, I think I described them before. Leadership, organizational behavior, communication. Not so much public speaking. Mostly like difficult conversations, management of conflict, also assertive communication, and self-regulation and mindfulness. Anything has to do with that part. And what else? And well, stress management. That's part of mindfulness and self-regulation. Those are my main topics. And if you want to get in touch with me, probably one easiest way would be to reach out through LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, there is my website is there, and you can contact me through LinkedIn. And I'll be happy to talk with you if you want to.
Wonderful. I know that this will be a question that if I don't ask, I'll be curious. Because you work with such a wide group of
Yes.
individuals, how do you find your clients?
Well, these days, because I'm a bit kind of lazy in terms of marketing, and it's not my forte, so I do a lot of subcontracting through different organizations that have the logistics, if you will, to acquire clients who work in corporations, because that's the most difficult thing to do. So I do a lot of that, and I do have some personal clients, some in Asia actually, and some in Europe. So, but mostly I work these days mostly on subcontracting through other companies who do all the, logistical work. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask because I need a little clarification. So when you say
Yeah.
subcontracting, they do the logistical work. So, for example, you might be subcontracted with ICF and you coach their coaches, or is it something different?
No, not ICF. No, corporations like who are. I don't want to give names here, but there's several companies these days who make contracts, if you will, with organizations who then send their employees, and these
Ah,
companies then distribute those employees to the coaches who work for them. Usually, they're not employees,
gotcha.
they're contractors. That's what I meant. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay,
Mm.
that's perfect. Now, not the companies who are contracting for the work, but the companies that you work for. Can Are you comfortable sharing any of those names? Because I'm sure there are some coaches who have probably never heard of that as an option and would think,
Sure.
"Oh, I may
Yeah.
want to check that out."
Yeah. One of them is called Better Up. Then I work
Mhm.
also. Yeah, just one's enough. Yeah.
Okay, I have heard of Better Up. Yeah,
Mm.
wonderful. Okay, Alec, this has been great. Like I said, I was very excited to talk with you, especially about the difference in the corporate versus professional
Mm.
coaching. And so that really rang a bell with me, and having this conversation has
Mm.
helped, and also the self regulation. So thank you for sticking in the game of coaching so long.
Thank
You've
you.
obviously
Thank
made
you.
an impact.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to do anything else, tell you the truth. Thank you very much, Kaneshi, for inviting me, for your generosity, and for being such a great host. hostess. I don't know. You say host or hostess?
Wonderful.